The Canary Islands, today a part of Spain, lie about 62 miles or 100 kilometers off the west coast of Africa, the closest country to them being Morocco. In Greek and Roman myth, the Isles of the Blessed are a region located somewhere far to the west of the Mediterranean, across the vast ocean and at the edge of the known world. It's been speculated that the Isles of the Blessed have at least a partial basis in reality, because there are 4 island groups that exist off the western coast of Iberia and northwest Africa, which could have inspired them. In terms of texts, our major account of a voyage to what are probably the Canary Islands comes to us from the natural history of Pliny the Elder, specifically in Book 6. He tells us that Juba II, king of Numidia, set off on a voyage to the west from which he eventually returned, and that he found at least 4 islands, only one of which had ruins. One island had some sort of a large stone which Juba interpreted as a temple, one of the islands was populated by lizards, one was populated by dogs, 2 of which he apparently brought back as gifts for the Romans, and that all of the islands had beaches covered with the decaying remains of sea monsters. So, outside of textual sources which describe the area to the west of the Strait of Gibraltar as being the location of the Isles of the Blessed, or Pliny's record of Juba's journey to some island chain, possibly the Canaries, what we have is fairly limited material evidence, but it does tell us that some Romans at least were in sporadic contact with at least one of the Canary Islands at some point in classical antiquity. Located fairly close to the Atlantic coast of Morocco is a chain of islands known as the Purple Islands, so called because it was one of the locations in the ancient world where purple dye could be acquired by harvesting the snails from which the purple ink was derived. The Phoenicians knew about them, as attested by archaeological evidence, and Pliny tells us that Juba II established a factory on Mogador, the biggest of the Purple Islands, to manufacture the dye. It is from Mogador that he is supposed to have sailed to the Isles of the Blessed, and eventually that island, along with all of Numidia's territory, was incorporated into the Roman state. It is something like 400 miles or 643 kilometers from Mogador to the Canary Islands, and evidently the Romans at some point made the journey. Whether the Romans, like Juba II, began at Mogador is not known. But given the precarious nature of ocean-going voyages in the ancient world, it is probably a safe bet that anyone who made the trip would travel along the African coast before heading to the Canary Islands instead of a straight shot. Lanzarote, the easternmost of the Canary Islands, is approximately 326 square miles in area, or 846 square kilometers, and it is the closest of the islands to the African coast. The archaeological site of El Bebedero, located on that island, has thus far turned up about 100 shards belonging to Roman amphorae, 9 pieces of some sort of metal instruments, and at least 1 piece of glass. Initially, fragments of amphora had been discovered in 1964, but in the 1990s, when El Bebedero was discovered, it became clear that there was some sort of a trade going on during the Roman period, as all the pottery had been dated between the 1st and the 4th centuries. Roman pottery, and specifically amphora, has an extremely extensive typology that has been developed over more than a century, and with that in mind, many of the amphora whose shards we have surviving appear to have come from southern Italy, and would have been carrying items like fish, salt, and olive oil. What the Romans would have gotten in return, if anything at all, is not clear. There are some scattered pieces of evidence that perhaps suggest fishing sites, but there is nothing that would suggest permanent Roman or even pre-Roman settlement coming from Europe, that is to say, not native. This has not, however, stopped some more interesting conjecture about Rome's relationship with the Canary Islands. There is a highly speculative idea that the Canary Islands functioned as some sort of a prison colony for the Roman Empire. Pliny records a rebellion that occurred during the reign of Claudius in Mauritania, and Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, who would later rise to fame by defeating the revolt of Boudica, was dispatched to put down this North African rebellion. Supposedly, prisoners of war were deported to the Canaries, but because there's a complete lack of any sort of evidence that there would be prisoner colonies or anything along these lines, we have no stonework, no negatives in the soil, nothing like that. Much of this depends on the idea that there was an apparent Berber cultural influence among the natives on the Canary Islands. This is, as of yet, however, completely unsubstantiated. That being said, we do know that there was at least limited Roman trade going on, which appears to have stopped following the collapse of the Western Empire. However, the archaeology of the Canary Islands is a fairly active field, so who knows? There may be more evidence uncovered in the future, aside from the pottery and bits of metal thus far discovered.